connections between them? To what extent can they learn from previous campaigns? To what extent can they learn from each other's campaigns? What does it take to bring about change in today's world? What can you do with new tools? So we're going to start with Hong Kong. So over to you, Lena, and then we'll be coming back to hear from our panelists after a few minutes. Over to you, Lena.
Thank you so much, Tom. Just before we went live to Manchester, we just chatted for a few minutes here about the things that Joshua has just been involved in and what that reminded us to feel about. So maybe we can start again by talking about what we discussed earlier about how much you think North Koreans would have heard about what's been going on in Hong Kong for the past few days and months, and what that tells us about the differences between North Korea and Hong Kong.
Yeah, sure. So North Koreans as a whole will have heard hardly anything about what's happening here in Hong Kong. Not nothing. You know, some North Koreans can go out to China and we'll hear a little bit more of global news from there. And there's been a tiny bit of reporting, as we just talked about, in the state media, but it's not really in detail about what's happening on the ground here. It's more about reporting the Beijing government's criticism of the US for their supposed interference in this issue and that kind of stuff. So it's not a complete blackout, but it's not that much at all. And maybe one of the things that points to is maybe one of the fundamental differences here, right? Maybe one of the fundamental things about activism and the democracy movements and so on, which is the importance of, sorry to be a little bit cheesy, but the importance of hope. Right? So I think that one of the key conditions here in Hong Kong is hope and momentum, and that is something that the North Korean government has been so effective in denying North Korean people. So if we maybe strip out a lot of the political factors and so on, at a fundamental level, I think that why North Korea is how it is and why the chance of a people's movement and so on is so low is the North Korean government has been so effective in this kind of tyranny of hopelessness. North Korean people don't have a hope to gather and actually make a change. The only way that they can imagine a change happening is if the leadership decides to go down a different path.
Yeah. So given that difference, given the fundamental impossibility of political dissent within the country itself, how do you do political activism related to North Korea? What does it even involve? What's the strategy?
Right, so it's difficult, but I think that it starts with a study of the target. So you have to study how the regime, the North Korean regime in this case, maintains power, and then maybe some of the ways that that's changing, maybe some of the ways that there are fissures or friction where the North Korean government's control or ideologies may be breaking down in some ways, and then trying to identify ways that you can accelerate that you can work with the North Korean people to undermine the North Korean government's control or degrade their ideologies. And so that can look like different methods to get information and foreign media and so on to the North Korean people. And one of the main ways that our organization does it is by working with North Koreans who are leaving the country. So whether you want to call them refugees, defectors, or exiles, working with North Koreans who have left in order to try and empower them as agents of change back into the country.
And how about in Hong Kong, Joshua? What would you say is changed in the democracy movement in the territory over the past 5 years? So you had the umbrella movement, and now we've had those protests for the past 4 months that have escalated quite badly over the past few days. How's your strategy developed throughout that time, because you've been involved from the very beginning?
Hong Kongers learned a lesson from the umbrella movement 5 years ago. In the past 4 months that I describe as the summer of discontent, I think how Hong Kong people realize how to maximize our uniqueness to advocate and to facilitate the global solidarity campaign. It just keep our momentum and also put more pressure on Beijing. As we are aware that Hong Kong people are really efficient, effective, and productive. And we are aware that if we need to seek and also increase more bargaining chip for Hong Kongers, how Hong Kongers who have lots of overseas citizens live in different global cities. And when we mobilize them to put pressure on Beijing government, it can really generate more pressure and also momentum. I remember on 29th of September, more than 60 cities around the world have Hong Kong as organized march, assembly, or rally to put pressure on Beijing and just focus and emphasize on our fundamental cause on free election, which means universal suffrage. The chief executive should not handpicked by Beijing. And that's compared to 5 years ago, we learned a lesson and realized how to engage in international advocacy can just let Beijing to be aware that even they ignore the voice of Hong Kong people in Hong Kong, when with the uprising China model, or Beijing to expand its influence, it needs to maintain its international reputation. And now what we have done in the past 4 months just prove and let the world to realize what is meant by the failure of the one country, two system.
And Sokil, what would you take from that, from looking at the way that the Hong Kong movement uses international mobilization, people outside, because you just said you also work a lot with North Koreans who've left. What could you take from that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important strategy, I think, and there are efforts of North Korean exiles, North Korean refugees around the world to try and rally and to try and, put pressure on different governments in the international community and trying to raise more support for the North Korean people. Maybe one of the weaknesses there is just the lack of North Korean exiles around the world, right? There's the most North Korean exiles in South Korea, and that's only about 30,000 people, and a lot of them are maybe not in the position of, being able to engage that politically because they've just arrived in South Korea as refugees and so on. So there's maybe a weakness in the population in general in terms of numbers and strength and so on, but nonetheless, it's something that we try and use, and we try and build a platform for North Koreans who have left the country to use their voice, so that the world can see North Korea as not just Kim Jong-un and missiles, but see North Korea as a country from the perspective of North Korean people, which I think is so lacking in the conversation about that issue.
That idea of one people fighting for something, that's become much more relevant in Hong Kong from an outside perspective over the past 4 months. How would you say that's developed throughout the movement, that sense of an idea, of an identity of Hong Kongers?
I think the identity of Hong Kong is really remarkable and significant, because in the previous day, always for the generation of baby boomers in the last century, they may just recognize Hong Kong is the borrowed place and borrowed time, and they just spend time here and even being recognized or defined by scholar as economic animal. But I think with the past 4 months, with the determination and the commitment of Hong Kongers, how they pay the price and even sacrifice, hope to make change in the political system reform, which just prove that how with the sense of belongings and with the solidarity, they are really proud, and I'm part of them, to be Hong Kongers. And I also have to emphasize on the mobilization strategy that compared to 5 years ago. 5 years ago, in the umbrella movement, it's mainly led by student leaders just like me, and foreign media or international community will recognize us as the student leader of the umbrella movement, which will have a board of decision maker gathered by different student activist group or student union to mobilize people to continue the civil disobedience movement. But how we realize the limitation and the restriction of the top-down command process, and it's really exhausting and time-consuming, and also ignore the talent and uniqueness of Hong Kongers, how we are more well-educated, and we are professional, and we have lots of experience to continue the movement. So within the past 4 months protests, we have realized how even with more decentralization mobilization platform, where we will recognize us have the leaderless movement, even we have no single individual leader that could represent 2 or even 3 million population.
Right. And on that note of leaderless movements, we're going to hand over to Tom in Manchester. That's all we have time for in Hong Kong.
Thank you very much, everyone in Hong Kong. Okay, Nimco, I'd like to come to you first, please. So you founded Daughters of Eve in 2010, and then later the Five Foundation. You've also written a book. So tell us a bit about your activism journey and how you have campaigned in different ways over the years.
So I think it's really interesting here to be here in Manchester, because my activism, I think, essentially did start here. I came back as a 7-year-old after being in Djibouti. My life changing with the consequence of FGM. And one of the key things I did was tell my teacher as a child, which was something I was meant to be ashamed of and embarrassed about, but I wasn't. So that was the basis of my activism, I think, was finally breaking the silence as a child. And what was interesting was that my teacher looked at me, and as this person I was expecting to make the world seem a little bit more normal, told me that this was something normal for girls like me, which for the first time in a country which I felt at home, I felt so alienated. And that took me another 20 years to be really able to speak about the issue of FGM. And ultimately we started Daughters of Eve in 2010 in order to lobby the UK government around the issues of FGM, because they were very much British girls like me who were being subjected to the practice. And for me, it was about lobbying the systems and the institutions. So at 7, I was dismissed by my teacher. At 11, I was in a major hospital in Cardiff with serious complications from FGM. And again, nothing was done. So I thought, if the real institutions don't care about British girls, then nothing can really happen. And then in 2013, having successfully worked with the coalition government, DFID, the Department for International Development, committed 36 million to lead the African-led movement, because a lot of the work that's happening around FGM is being led on the African continent. And the Five Foundation is a successful move from the domestic into the international work. And I think the UK work has come to its fruition by the fact that last year the FGM was added to the Children's Act. And I know the fact that if another child like me was at risk of FGM, she'd be protected. But now it's about supporting the African-led movement. And within the book that I wrote, which is called Things We're Told Not to Talk About, was essentially that whole concept of shame. The female anatomy is very much policed by culture and religion around the world. It doesn't matter whether you're Somali, whether you're East Africa, rural East African, or even living in East London. Ultimately, women are not told to talk about their experiences. And for me, breaking the silence has been the fundamental basis of my activism, and not being ashamed of something that happened to me, but really trying to get the world to understand that. So I think that's been the connections between Daughters of Eve, which was a personal endeavor, to the Five Foundation, which is a global activism program to really ensure that we end FGM by 2030.
Okay, and what form does the activity of the Five Foundation take? So what can you actually do on the ground? What are the tactics in practice?
So the fundamental role of the Five Foundation is a global partnership. The work to end FGM is being done by women on the front line in Africa. And at the moment, only 2% of global funding goes to the women in Africa who are doing this work, though, women who have actually put the agenda of FGM on the table, who've taken it to the UN. So what I do personally is to elevate those stories, to get the Department for International Development, public finance, public and private sectors in order to invest in that. So for me, it's to be an advocate on behalf of the women that are really doing the work on the ground in Africa, and trying to get the funding there.
Right, so trying to get that 2% to go up. Where's the rest of it going then?
International organizations. So at the moment is the fact that, I will be honest, that the international development agenda is very racist and sexist. So we don't trust African women to be the real agents of change. So we are committing money to the issue of FGM, but that's getting sucked up at national level. So we have people in Kenya. When it comes to Kenya, it's the most successful country in tackling FGM, so it's gone down to about 21%. So, but the money at the moment is stuck in the capital cities, and ultimately you've got the Samburu region, which FGM is at 98%, and women who are saving girls are not getting the money. So it's a lot of bureaucracy, where the fact that we are trusting large NGOs as opposed to women on the front line. It doesn't take millions in order to end FGM, but it does take the minute number of amount of monies that we have to be spent well and to be given to the women that are really doing the work. So large NGOs have joined the Five Foundation as much as on-the-ground activism as well. Okay, great. Richard, I'd like to come to you now. So your wife was imprisoned a bit more than, 3.5 years ago now. So what's you had activism thrust upon you, as it were. How's your approach changed, and what's the state of play at the moment?
That's exactly right. It's a real privilege to be here, given I'm here with some proper activists rather than obviously our story is I stumbled into this, was a middle-aged accountant, Nazanin, my wife, was arrested on holiday, and we've muddled our way through it. I think to pick up on what some of the other speakers have said, for me, the most important part of my activism is campaigning. It's speaking out, it's raising Nazanin's story to the world at large to be able to come to events like this. And it's also keeping hope alive that actually, part of being an activist is being belligerent and difficult and insist. The world doesn't have to be like this. This is nonsense. And just to keep battling away. And for me, that's changed over time. And at the beginning, I just talked about our story. Gradually, I calmed down and realized other people were going through it. There are other situations. There are things you can learn from lots of different ways.
So this is part of a broader trend that Iran has been essentially taking hostages. And do people know about that? You're trying to raise awareness of the bigger picture as well as your individual story.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Iran's not unique, but it's quite prominent in doing it in a practice of certain countries taking hostages for leverage with other countries. And at the beginning you think, well, I'm innocent, this is not... And you realise actually other people are also struggling, and then you realise that actually it's quite tough for diplomats to acknowledge this is what's going on, and you do need to put it bluntly, and if you don't call yourselves hostages, no one else will. I think the other thing to pick up on what some of the speakers were saying over in Hong Kong, for me with campaigning, a lot of it is just getting noticed and just trying different ways to creatively, and actually that no one's in charge. No one's in charge. There's kind of a creative anarchy the whole time of looking for different things to do. So, for instance, recently this summer we had a hunger strike. That we didn't plan on doing it, just Nazanin went on and I joined her. We set up in front of the Iranian embassy to do it. And actually then lots of supporters, it wasn't us, came along and started decorating the walls of the embassy with post-it notes that they'd seen the guys in Hong Kong doing. And there was a way in which actually, a lot of campaigning is making it up as you go along. Just to keep on trying, keep on hoping, keep on battling, keep on being clear that, listen, world notice this is not acceptable. The authorities won't. And the job is to be belligerent. So I'm grateful for the opportunity.
And so you have to constantly change tactics. Is sort of part of. There's no right way of doing this.
Yeah, you can try something, it'll work for a while, and then it won't work. Some things will work much better than expected. Some things will not work. Some things will not work and then will work. And there's a lot of sort of just patience and energy. And I think it was really well put from the guys in Hong Kong. The most important thing is to keep that hope that the world can be different, the world should be different, and by God will I make it.
Okay, well, I'd like to open up to questions now. And in fact, Nimco, you had a question for Richard, didn't you, about work-life balance, as it were?
Yeah, it's because I think we are both thrown into the whole issue of activism, and I think self-care is a fundamental thing that I didn't understand. So I just wanted to really ask, how do you take care of yourselves in order to stay strong in order to be able to continue with the campaign?
Yeah, so I think there's two answers to that. The first is, in some ways I find there is an energy that comes from campaigning. Partly, ours is a very specific story. Like I'm battling for my family. And so there's sitting silently, not doing anything was much harder than battling. But there is always a tension between, for me, kind of between being campaigning husband and being a real husband and a real dad. And you can see it, particularly at the moment. So we've got a decision to make about bringing Gabriella home. That's my daughter.
This is your daughter, who's now at a school age, and so you've made this very difficult decision, or are in the process of making this decision about bringing her home.
Yeah, and probably I've made the decision, and then we've had to wait a while for Nazanin to be ready for it. And it's tough. And it's tough both in terms of the mechanics of that happening and the disruption, and also one of the consequences of always being in the media is that this is a human story that people follow, and then it's tough to manage what is a little girl adapting to, leaving a mummy, leaving a granny. So,
Nimco, how do you deal with this, with the kind of... you can't be campaigning all the time. How do you get away from it? Do you go running? Do you do something else?
I do get up at 7 a.m. to go to the gym these days, but ultimately that was a personal journey that I had to find because I am fighting a 4,000-year-old traditional practice which ultimately has blighted the life of 200 million women in the world. And for me, I think it's one of the key things is that I can't be an FGM survivor and be myself, so I have to be one on the other. And ultimately, it has been difficult trying to have that conversation with people, and the first thing they see is is to ask about the FGM as opposed to what I watched on TV and everything else. So it has been a difficult conversation, and it has also been a difficult journey. But ultimately, I think the media conversation was very interesting. That hope is a fundamental thing. That when I talk about FGM, I talk about the numbers, but I also talk about the fact that by 2030 that we could be living in a world for the first time that girls are free from FGM. So I think hope sells a lot more than horror, and that was a fundamental thing that I chose when I first came out. I didn't say I was a victim of FGM, I said I was a survivor. But I think there's also a level of disrespect to the survivors of sexual violence or other forms of violence when it comes to telling their own stories. And I'm very protective about other survivors and saying the fact that the media can be very voyeurish at the times. And it's like, we are more than just what happened to our anatomy. And I think that's something that I'm really passionate about saying a lot right now.
Okay, now we're going to try using the link up with Hong Kong, because Richard, you had a question for Joshua, I believe. So can you hear us in Hong Kong?
Hi, Joshua.
Yes.
Hello. So my question would be, it's almost about sustaining energy. I know I find with us with campaigning, and it's been, 3 years now, that I thought it would be a sprint, and it's turned out to be a marathon. So I just wanted to know how you manage to, what is a long struggle, keep the energy of the movement going.
In such uphill battle, and it's really a struggle when we experience the crackdown on human rights in the past 5 years. I've been arrested for 8 times and being jailed for 3 times, but just spending around 120 days in prison, and the price I pay is really small. I think for my personal journey, engage in street activism or social movement is a process of self-actualization, to turn something impossible to be possible. When we knew our friends and colleagues being jailed and arrested in the past 3 or 4 months, more than 2,000 Hong Kongers were arrested. The youngest one at the age of 10 is a 10-year-old primary school kid. It would just encourage us to realize that how facing the largest authoritarian regime in the world, we have no chance and no room for us to step backward or to regret, and we still need to continue the fight. So sometimes we'll be a bit depressed and having the struggle, but I think how families and friends and religious as a Christian, it really helps me a lot.
Okay, now I'd like to see if we have any questions from the floor here. If you do have one, could you wave your yes card in the air, because that will be easier for me to see. We have a question over here. First question of the day. Please go get a mic over to here. Here it comes, and if you could wait for it to appear. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. To Mr. Ratcliffe, so certainly there has been a lot of press coverage about Nazanin, and you have talked about bringing her story to the wider world. So do you think that this knowledge of her situation in Iran, do you think that this has helped her in the sense that people are certainly more aware of what is happening to hostages in Iran, but equally a regime like that has perhaps capitalized off that as a diplomatic tool? So what is your view on that? Thank you.
Very good question. Go ahead.
Yeah, good question. Yes, it's definitely double-edged. My honest sense is that speaking out about Nazanin protects her. And there's a way in which abuses can happen in silence that are not able to happen in public. It also makes it more complicated diplomatically. And there are arguments I have with the Foreign Office, which is the British government, all the time around,
So they're like, keep quiet, we'll sort this out.
Broadly. And to be fair, it's not entirely disingenuous. There are moments where it is a bit. But I think empirically, there's no evidence that keeping quiet helps in any other cases. Keep speaking out is a lot easier to keep her protected. And certainly, I think, the benefits of having her in the light and of her knowing that she's looked after and cared for certainly outweigh the risks.
Okay, brilliant. Right, do we have any more questions on the floor? We have one down here, and do we have any more while I'm looking around? Yes, we have another one over there, so we'll come to you in a minute. Go ahead, please. Oh, wait, is the mic up? Oh, is it working? Can we have a working microphone? Okay. Where's the other microphone that we just had? Is this the same one? I think we've got a spare one down here, so why don't we try this one?
Hello, does it work?
It does. That's called a sound check, by the way.
Yes, this is a question for Joshua. I'm not sure that violence really is the answer, and as violence escalates, it just gives the other side more and more reasons to get involved and started repressing things. I mean, you think about what happened at Tiananmen Square, for example. So how come the people in Hong Kong have, why don't they take a leaf out of somebody like Mahatma Gandhi's book in terms of a peaceful protest, which would make it a lot harder for the authorities to clamp down hard on them?
Excellent question. Did you hear that in Hong Kong? The use...
Yes.
Go ahead, Joshua.
We strongly realize how force has been used by protesters or activists in the past few months. But instead of condemn on any kind of force used by the side of protester, I think it's how government teach Hong Kong people peaceful protest is useless or at least not effective enough. We have 1/4 of population, 25% of citizens, 2 million people take to the street with our calls on free election. But when life-threatening weapons were used by riot police, it's just generated more and more discontent, especially we just realized how they turned Hong Kong from a global city to a police state. Especially they are not only targeting activists, they even targeted journalists, even a first aider, even one journalist result in permanent blindness because being fired by rubber bullets. So when government refused to conduct any kind of systematic reform, it was just trigger more and more reason for people to aware that they need to continue their protest, no matter with the incentives of self-protection or self-defense. Even it may be difficult for everyone in Hong Kong agree on all the behaviors of protesters. But all we aware is how Hong Kong government is just a puppet of Beijing and refuse to be responsible or accountable and just send out riot police with those lethal weapons and even use live round bullets fired towards a 14-year-old school kid. Is this the solution? So I would say that escalation of force or escalation of violence might not be the good, might not generate positive impression around the world. But we still need to realize what is the fundamental problem. What is the root cause for more than 25% of population took to the street? And finally, in conclusion, if 25% of population in UK took to the street, I believe the government might resign immediately. But it didn't happen in Hong Kong because here is Hong Kong without democracy.
Yeah, I'm not sure what we think about whether Boris and his pals would resign. It doesn't seem to be possible to get them. They seem to have no shame. Anyway, we had another question over here, and the holy microphone has been returned to here. Does this microphone work?
Hi.
Oh, it does. Go ahead, please.
It works. So this is for Ms. Nimco. So you talked about that the majority of money and funds that go to Africa do not reach the target. They don't.
He's behind you.
They don't get to African women. So how do we tackle this corruption? How do we release these funds, and how do we make them reach the target? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an incredible question. And one of the key things is that each and every one of us has a role to play in that because we're taxpayers and we're voters. And 0.7% of our GDP is committed to international development. That's 14 billion every year that we want to be able to give to the world, to developing countries. And at the moment, and it's for us to make the case for African women, it's for us to make the case for direct funding. At the moment, DFID is an incredible organization, but it's very restricted and very scared. It's scared of Daily Mail front pages of saying we're wasting 100 million here, like a million there. So it's for us to make the case to say that if we really do want to change the world, that if we do really want to ensure that the Sustainable Development Goals targets are met, that we fight for women and that we fund women. So whenever there's an election coming up, each and every one of those people that are knocking on your door should be asked, are they going to be funding women on the front line of ending FGM directly? Because ending FGM is ultimately sustainable to environmental issues, into global warming, to global peace. And there is nowhere in the world where FGM is more than 40%, where there is prosperity, success, and security, and that is not a coincidence. Where you break the most vulnerable people in society, there will be disaster and there will be disease. So ultimately, it is about us as citizens and us as taxpayers really making a case to government. And there are some incredible people in government at the moment. So DFID is very much committed to that. And if you work in the private sector, it's easier to get your money to the front line there than it is to get government aid money. So I would say each and every one one of you can become an activist and really, like, you know, ask your MPs to ensure that when money's being sent away, it's being sent to the right places.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, we're going to go over to Hong Kong now. They're going to have some questions from that end. Over to you, Lena.
Yes, we do. And I think the first question is going to come from Sokil, who's sitting on the stage next to me.
Yeah, sure. I'll throw a question back to Manchester and to NIMCO. And I'd like to ask, since you've been working so much on, gender rights and female rights and empowerment in Africa, is there anything that you've identified in terms of approaches or tactics that might be applied anywhere? And when I say anywhere, maybe even as far as North Korea?
I believe in a very, act local, think global kind of theory, and ultimately it's about doing our history. It's doing our history and learning from the women that came before us. I stand on the shoulders of incredible women from the African continent who've actually led the path in order for me to be here. So I think it's about giving back and understanding that we're not the first people to come up with an idea. And it doesn't matter where you are, whether it's your grandmother, whether it's your mother, whether it's the suffragettes here in the UK and in Manchester specifically, there is always history in what you want to do. And if you want to advocate for the future, it's about looking at the past and really giving thanks and setting your foundations upon the women that came before you. And I know that there's probably incredible women in North Korea who've been doing some incredible stuff. And the most successful women are not always the loudest women. They're the women that push the next generation forward. And I've been immensely privileged to have a lot of those women in my life and a lot of those women to look up to. So I think giving back and understanding that we're here because of great women whose names we might not know but have sacrificed a lot for us. So that would be my advice, is not to think that you're the first person to think of the activism which you want to kind of take forward.
Thanks very much, Manchester. Do we have any questions from the floor in Hong Kong? You can ask both our panelists on stage here and also the two on stage in Manchester. Yeah? Wait for the microphone, so everybody in Manchester needs to hear you too.
I have a question for Joshua. So before the panel started, we saw a poll from The Economist showing how some people think that the movement going on in Hong Kong will change Hong Kong forever, and some think it won't, and it's about 50-50. So I remember being in middle school watching the Hong Kong democracy movement and thinking this was going to absolutely revolutionize Hong Kong, change it all, and it did die down 5 years ago. So I'm asking you, do you think this movement will change Hong Kong forever, and how it is or will not be different?
From my personal observation and the participation in the past 4 months, I left prison one day after 2 million people took to the street. And I strongly experienced it will change Hong Kong forever. Especially, it's just imply how the fundamental difficulties for Beijing to rule Hong Kong with stability and prosperity if they still refuse to let Hong Kong people enjoy free election. For example, yesterday Hong Kong government announced the emergency status and to impose the anti-mask law, which just bypassed the legislature. And if they bypass the legislature yesterday, they can also impose any law, just bypass the legislature without any consultation. And with how they transformed Hong Kong to be a police state with more violence. In the previous day, when you ask people who live around the world, what is their impression on Hong Kong? Perhaps it might be a global financial center, international city, or maybe with Chinese restaurant, with Bruce Lee or Jackie Chan, or etc. That's people's general perception in Hong Kong. But now, when under the hardline rule of President Xi, the only or the most in Hong Kong. And it's just proof that Beijing hoped to rule Hong Kong with one country, two systems. But when they broke the promise in the Sino-British Joint Declaration, in the international treaty that registered in the United Nations, it's just proof that it's not only how one country, two system changed to be one country, 1.5 system, but even it's the fall and the fall of the one country, two system, fall of the current constitutional framework. So why I would say Hong Kong will change forever, and there's no way for us to go back. It's because we all realize that when they just continue to conduct mass arrests and prosecution and to generate white terror or chilling effect, it's not only targeted ordinary citizen or youngster just like me, even business sector or the open business environment in Hong Kong is already under threat, and it will change the whole world. It will just fundamentally change the world reputation on Hong Kong's. Is still the global financial center, or it's just a financial city under the hardline rule of Beijing? I think that's the fundamental differences to let Hong Kong turn no way back anymore.
Thank you. Any more questions from the floor? Yes, over there. Thank you.
I have a question for Joshua as well. And you mentioned the importance of international advocacy and mobilization. So apart from transnational organized movements, you yourself also went to Washington to talk to U.S. lawmakers. And some people say that these efforts are futile. So to what extent do you think that these discussions with foreign governments can actually have an impact on what's happening in Hong Kong?
With the trade war chaos, Taiwan presidential election, and how Belt and Road Initiative have to expand in Europe face restriction. Without this three factor, will Hong Kong government and Beijing completely withdraw the bill on early September? I doubt on it. When we recognize Hong Kong as the global city, Hong Kong's matter to the world, and also international relation or international dynamics also affect the decision made by President Xi to Hong Kong. It's the first time for President Xi Jinping compromised to Hong Kong people in the past few years under his leadership. So I would say that meet with US or UK lawmaker to seek for bipartisan support we just hope to prove that support Hong Kong's democratization or not is not the matter of right or left. It's just a matter of right or wrong. And that's the reason we hope the voice of Hong Kong people, even not being heard in Beijing, but it can still be heard in the international community.
Anybody got any questions for Manchester, maybe?
Do we have any more questions? We've got room for one more question here, we think. We've got one here, we've got one here. So by a completely random process of I'm choosing you. So please could you wait for the microphone?
A lot of things have been achieved in the last few months, but where we are today is also, it's a difficult situation. I wouldn't say a deadlock, but it's a difficult situation. So now going back to, let's say, June, May, right? What would you say the protesters, the movement should have done differently maybe? Or maybe where would you say maybe I should have done things differently in order to have maybe advanced even further or done things a little bit differently in a way that would have made the government respond differently? I'm wondering whether there are any learnings from your side.
Hong Kong is under the rule of largest authoritarian regime in the world, and the deadlock is generated by them. When 1 million people took to the street on 9th of June and 2 million people in Hong Kong took to the street on 16th of June, I was also in prison. So I would say that if Hong Kong government decide to completely withdraw the evil bill on mid of June, I don't expect or assume this movement will continue for more than 100 days. And now I think it's the question for President Xi or for Beijing. What Hong Kong people are asking for, perhaps the behaviors or what have been done by protesters might not be widely accepted by all of the people around the world. But when the fundamental cause are just asking for free election, which means universal suffrage, we hope to elect our own government. The leader of the Hong Kong should not be only manipulated by Beijing. If this promise or if this demand go too far, if not, when will Hong Kong and Beijing government to solve the deadlock? I think it depends on them instead of depends on us.
Okay, do we have time for one more question from the Manchester end? We have one question over here, so please go ahead with your question.
Hi, my question's for Ms. Nico as well.
Oh, hello. Sorry.
Yeah, my question's for Nico. I was wondering, you kind of spoke a lot about international racism and institutionalized sexism, but a lot of the power and a lot of the real change comes from grassroots organizations. So do you think that real change can come from collaborations with those kind of top-down approach where the power might actually be a little bit systemically wrong? Or do you think, how can we empower grassroots communities and local organizations to keep making positive impact kind of bottom up? Do you think there's emphasis on one or the other? Do you think it's both? Or kind of how would you go about empowering those grassroots communities?
Yeah, no, it has to be both, and I consider myself that kind of connector within the middle. The fact that the money does sit in New York, it does sit in London, it does sit in these international institutions, and aid does work when it's given to grassroots activism. So ultimately, it's about trusting that our systems can change, and I have faith in that. The fact that I've spent the last 7.5 years talking about one of the most isolated issues, and now it's front page news. So the whole point is, it's about getting the women on the ground. I really want African women's voices to be more than a poster on a fundraising pack. I want them to be the heart and the soul of the way that we do international development work. And for that to happen, each and everyone in this room has to take that forward. So ultimately, I think we can address that sexism, and I'm living proof of that with the fact that the success we've had with both the coalition governments and, ironically, a Conservative party. So I think things can change, but you have to be really dogmatic, and you have to keep beating at those doors.
Great, that's a great note to end on. We talked about this, the title of this session is Activism and Pragmatism. You've given us marching orders there for what we can do, and it's been very inspiring to hear from all of our speakers and activists, so Nimco Ali, Richard Ratcliffe, and in Hong Kong, Joshua Wong and Sokil Park. Thank you very much to all of our speakers.